So we have a real problem right now, and it's going on not only here in Canada or in the United States, it's going on all over the world, and it's this opioid abuse problem. It's become a major global public health problem. In the United States, we have over 1 million people who are addicted to opioids, and only about 25% are actually receiving any treatment. Withdrawal from opioids can be an unbearable experience, and you're going to see some examples when I get into showing you just how much it can pull you into this addiction and destroy your life and the lives of people around you. And it becomes a major obstacle to undergoing detoxification for that very reason. Today, most of the approaches are pharmacokinetic in nature, and they target the mu opioid receptors in the brain. And this is where heroin and its metabolites bind with an exceptional affinity in the brain and do not effectively block opioid craving. And as a result, opioid addicts have a very, very high rate of relapse. The opiate death crisis in Canada, since we're here in Canada, I think is really important to understand. In 2018, there were 1,489 illicit drug overdose deaths just in British Columbia alone. 71% of these were 30 to 59, and males accounted for roughly 80% of all deaths. In Canada overall, there were 4,000 of these deaths, and this is an increase of 400% since 1993. So last year, one person died every single day in Canada on every day except 11 days of the year. Just think about that. These drug overdoses are far exceeding motor vehicle accidents, suicide, and homicide deaths, which are all of the major types of premature deaths occurring in Canada. A chief coroner of the British Columbia province had identified an inordinarily high number of drug-related deaths related to the very real and very serious drug problem, and strongly recommended unconventional measures needed to be implemented to reduce this mortality. What's interesting, that was a statement he made 25 years ago. Nobody was listening. And I know for a fact, since I had gone to many school districts in British Columbia to give lectures on nutrition, that when I brought this up with individuals that are treating addictions of this nature and told them that you could use vitamin C and use other nutrients to help restore people's health that were addicts, they all poo-pooed it. They said, where's the science? Where's the double-blind placebo-controlled trials? Well, I said, if you ask me to come back, I'd be glad to go into it in some details. I never got another invitation from those school districts. So just to show you how closed-minded the community was, despite the fact that they realized they had a serious problem. It was as if it didn't get the blessing of the Pope from the medical establishment that this is okay to use, that they would feel comfortable trying something unconventional as was suggested by the provincial official. So in the United States, the opioid crisis has received a great deal of media attention. There have been 400,000 people who have died of opioid overdoses between 1999 and 2017. And as a result, it resulted in the first drops that have been seen in more than 60 years in life expectancy. During 2010 and 2015, these heroin overdose deaths quadrupled from 3,000 to 12,000, almost 13,000 deaths. By 2016, opioid overdose deaths went from 8,000 in 1999 to 42,380 by 2016, accounting for 66% of all drug overdose deaths. The following year, in 2017, drug overdose deaths rose to 70,237. This is the largest increase in opioid overdose deaths, and it occurs primarily in males 25 to 44 years of age. The sharp increases in the supply of heroin and illicit fentanyl has contributed to the majority of these overdose cases. And I'm going to point out and actually provide you evidence that heroin is the major problem, not fentanyl, which is constantly being mentioned in the media. Children of parents who are addicted to opioids are twice as likely to attempt suicide. And when you look at girls at the ages of 10 to 14, the suicide rate associated with opioid overdose has gone up 13% each year since 2007. So here we see sort of a nice graph that shows the rise that's been occurring in males and females for total overdose deaths. And you see it starting at 16,849. And by 2017, we've got over 70,000 deaths accounted for. So we can look at regions of the country, and what you find is there really isn't that much difference. Heroin without synthetic opioids is still the #1 cause of death in all regions of the country. And when we look at just comparing fentanyl reports to heroin reports, notice the dashed line down by the bottom of each box. Those little lines down there are your fentanyl, and you can see that heroin far exceeds the number of deaths that are being reported, whether you're looking at the Northeast, Midwest, South, or Western sectors of the United States. Now, what do we know about morphine, heroin, and fentanyl? Well, I think maybe a little basic information might be helpful. And so let me go a little bit off the slide here for a second and just provide some foundational knowledge about heroin in particular and morphine. Actually, heroin itself has little opioid activity. It's when it's metabolized in the body that it does have opioid activity. Most heroin sold in the streets is made from morphine that has been purified from opium derived from poppies, a flower, poppies. The source has some 40 alkaloids, of which morphine constitutes between 8 to 19% on average, along with 5 other alkaloids that together provide a significant group of compounds that when it comes to delivering the state of euphoria, it provides that sense that the user is seeking. So it's a combination of compounds, not always just the morphine alone. Ultimately, the purity of street heroin can range anywhere from 5% to as high as 75%. And that's because it's diluted down from 100% pure heroin. This is done by what they call in the streets stepping on it, which in street parlance is to use adulterants such as sucrose, fructose, let me think of some others, lactose, starch, even caffeine and other drugs to reduce the amount. And so you take a certain amount of heroin, you step on it, as we call it, then eventually you increase its profitability because it's the heroin you're paying for and the adulterants are real cheap. And so it increases the profit level. And so you have to ask the addict when you're treating them, what type of street drug in what context and what community and what its purity is to get an idea of how much vitamin C you're going to use to treat them. I came across this saying that this was actually an individual that was treated for heroin, and I asked if he could maybe give me sort of a feeling what it's like. And he wrote this down, and I'd like to read this to you. It's like warm golden sunshine flowing through your veins. It makes everything, and it makes everything beautiful, and it makes anything seem within your reach. Then you come down and you need more. And we'll do anything to get it. It's your best friend at first. And when you still can't quit, you'd never dream of it. Then at some point that is indefinable and inevitable, it turns on you. It grows fangs and claws, and it wants your soul. It lies to you and tells you that you aren't doing anything wrong. It makes you feel like you would rather die than spend another second without it. Then before you know it, your days are consumed with waking up dry, heaving, and so sick you want to die, provided you could sleep at all, which is dependent on whether or not you had a shot before you went to bed. Once you finally get a first hit of the day, then it's time to start really looking for something to get you by. You lie, you scam, you break the law, you sell your soul to get just barely enough to keep you out of bed. You take that last shot of the day and become filled with dread and exhaustion, thinking how you'll manage it tomorrow. Then you go to bed only to wake up a few hours later because your muscles are twitching and cramping. You fight with yourself for 10 minutes about whether or not to take that small hit you saved for the morning, inevitably take it, and then wake up a few hours later only to start all over again. And you'd rather die than live another way. That person lived in Harlem. That's the red area toward the top of Manhattan Island. We've divided it up for you on the screen so you can see where East Harlem is, Morningside Heights, the Upper West Side, Yorkville, all these areas, Hell's Kitchen, Lower East Side, the East Village that you might have heard of and on this island called Manhattan, part of New York City, which has 5 boroughs. Well, at the time that I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, I lived in the upper West Side, right on the border with Harlem and Morningside Heights. Now, Morningside Heights was well known to people who went to Columbia University or studied at Juilliard School of Music. Later, Juilliard moved south to Lincoln Square, where Lincoln Center is, but that's where Columbia University is. And it plays an important role about what happened to help me to keep this energy going, to share this information about how strong this vitamin C treatment is in helping to curb heroin withdrawal syndrome. So this is a park that's just 3 blocks from my middle school. It's called Needle Park, today also known as Sherman Square. Gave it a nice name, didn't they? Certainly sounds better than Needle Park. Well, back in the 1960s, this park, and this is what it looks like right now, you would have seen dozens of heroin addicts nodding off or sleeping right there in the park, or buying or selling heroin. This is the place where everybody came to in Manhattan to buy heroin, and whatever they could get there, they would then take to various neighborhoods around the city and over to across the Hudson River to New Jersey. So this was a major center for distribution. And you wonder, how was it possible that this could go on day after day? Well, there was a lot of corruption going on at the time. And if you mention to a police officer, as my parents did several times, why aren't you doing something about it? You wouldn't get any response. It was sort of like, well, are they bothering you? Is there somebody you want me to arrest? I mean, basically, they were all on the take. But what really bothered me was I was going to go to this middle school from my elementary school, and that happened to be on 77th Street, and Needle Park was on 75th Street. We're 5 blocks apart from each other. What really got me one day was I used to go to the American Museum of Natural History and do a little curating assistance in the Department of Gems and Minerals, just to get away from all the gangs and violence and awful things that were going on inside the school and outside the school. And it was right across the street. And what I observed so many times was my peers performing sex acts on the backside of the museum, including girls who were 12 and 13 years old, some of whom were in my class, performing sex acts with grown men to support their heroin addiction. And I would watch them shoot up in the staircases, in the bathrooms, and even in the back of the classroom. So now that I was back in New York City from Albuquerque, New Mexico, I wanted to know, hey, what's going on? And is there a chance that this professor would allow me to try vitamin C in treating heroin addicts? So this slide says, what happened to $73 million? Cornstarch or flour? Useless evidence. That was the headline. Manhattan heroin dealers were mainly concentrated on the Upper West Side and in Harlem. To score, an addict would typically visit the basement apartment of a brownstone on a side street somewhere between 72nd Street and 96th Street, between Broadway and Columbus Avenue. He'd knock on a window to be admitted and buy either a $2 or $3 bag. That's the precursors of today's standard $10 bag. So that's your hit, quote unquote, that they're seeking. It may be hard for individuals to know or believe this is even possible, but we had seen addicts come to the center where I used vitamin C that had an addiction that cost them up to $2,000 a day. And I want you to think of how many, if you're a prostitute, how many Johns you've got to take care of for that kind of money, or what kind of theft you have to be engaged in, or racketeering or something that you have to do to support that addict. So really, they're not coming there to stop using heroin. They're there because they just want to get their addiction under control and get them to a more affordable level. Less prostitution, less crime. That's basically what the motivation was. And they knew they didn't have an option, because the amount of heroin they were now using wasn't giving them anywhere the pleasure, euphoria that it had given them when they started as addicts. And there was really no other choice but just to go through withdrawal. And folks, I've seen it. I know how bad it looks. Your stomach is tearing you apart. Your back is just tearing you. You vomit, you get sweaty, you're freezing, you're hot. You can't sleep all night. And this goes on for these addicts sometimes for a whole week before they finally can leverage off and get control of their addiction. And they walk out of the facility with really very little mental health support, any medical support, and they're back on the street, and they go immediately back to their more controllable, affordable addiction. Joseph Lightford wrote a very interesting book called The Cage. And I came across this in a bookstore in East Harlem back in the late 1970s. And he eloquently described the despair and suffering that was being experienced by those who lived within the boundaries of this Upper West Side, gang-riddled, corrupt, and crime-infested street neighborhood. Lightford grew up in the Lower East Side section of Manhattan that was known as Hell's Kitchen. Maybe some of you have heard of it. There's actually been a movie about it. It harbored generations of immigrants to the promised land. Yet when he moved into the Cage to watch over a tenement building he had purchased, he found it difficult to block out the sirens and sounds that instilled fear and resentment. It did not take him long to realize that this was a different community, a far more insidiously dangerous neighborhood riddled by tragic episodes of crime and violence, nestled among decomposing tenement buildings, occupied by broken spirits, escaping from hopelessness and despair. When I read The Airtight Cage, there was a moment where I actually broke down because he described some of the things that he saw. And it reminded me of something that happened when I was about 8, 9 years old. There were 2 girls that lived on the other side of the courtyard in the apartment building that I lived in with my parents. And this father came home drunk almost every single night. And there was a bar right across the street from our tenement building, right on the corner there, 89th and 89th and Amsterdam Avenue. And one night he came in, you could hear him yelling and screaming, "Here it goes again," as I would say to myself. And this time what he did is he made it impossible for the girls to get out of the door of their room after he lit it with gasoline, and they burned to death. And I remember them screaming. That's the kind of neighborhood it was. And there were events like this that went on constantly. Well, here we see a self-portrait by Sterling Witt, who is the individual in the green shirt there. And when I met him, he was really hooked on heroin, something awful. He had been to a treatment facility in Lexington, Kentucky. He had been to treatment facilities in Texas, Missouri, one in Boston, one that was run by a program at Harvard University. And he had heard about the vitamin C. And I said, why not? Come on out. So I'm going to show you what happened to him. So let's understand why people use heroin. Besides the euphoria that you read, or I read to you earlier, or you read to yourself, it's in the brain where we experience pain. It's perceived and it's experienced. Pain signals interact with many different brain areas, including those involved in physical sensation, thinking, such things as executive function to make the right decisions in your life, various cognitive processes, where am I, what should I do, how should I do it, things that rely on memory and emotion. Humans can remember a single painful experience, sometimes for their entire life. Such memories can be powerful. For example, we never purposely touch a hot stove a second time. We do it accidentally and remember, oh my gosh, get away from that stove. But the first time we do it, not realizing that stoves can be very hot, and we put our hand in there and burn our hands and fingers, that's something we'll never forget. Now, I want you to multiply that experience that I talked about earlier, the two girls that were screaming and couldn't get out of the room while they were burning to death. And I want you to think of all the people in the courtyard of those two apartments that were listening to those girls and what's going through their mind at the time and the memory that stored in all of us that had to listen to them screaming. We never forget that. And so I make the association when somebody says, oh, there's a fire on the hill. That word fire reminds me of what those girls went through. Now, I want you to think of the traumas that some individuals go through who get sexually abused or beaten or watch their parents fighting and hitting each other, and all the awful things that can occur in dysfunctional dynamics within families, and how all of a sudden using something as powerful as morphine converted into heroin once it's metabolized and gets in your brain, and how that gives you this incredible moment of relief away from that pain, away from the memories of those experiences. That's what we're talking about. So experiencing pain yourself and the emotions it elicits and the effect it has on thinking process can also produce empathy for others or family members experiencing psychological or physiological pain. What we're basically saying is that we have the capacity to have empathy for others, but sometimes it takes you over the top to where you require something to take care of getting over and beyond the pain that you're experiencing on behalf of what you're seeing others go through. So we know that mental health disorders can amplify pain. And what basically happens is you start ruminating, and your rumination is associated with the perceived dysfunction that can lead to stress, anxiety, and depression. And it's these mood disorders that can engage parts of the brain that process pain and facilitate an increasing degree of rumination that enhances one's focus on the perceived and discomforting pain. Basically, we're saying there's a sort of builds up to a certain crescendo. And at that point, you're seeking some type of relief. And sometimes the relief that you seek can be found in a lot of very positive ways. For example, for me, what I found is I would just go out and run. And I became a pretty good runner, actually joined a great team at the university. But it gave me something that I could do where that was very positive. Um, and, and that's just run as far as I wanted to until I was exhausted. And so over time, I became a pretty good athlete. And that's one way you can deal with pain. You don't always have to use drugs. I'm just saying, this is part of what treating mental health disorders is all about, is finding alternatives, options that are far more constructive to deal with the discomfort that individuals experience so they don't turn to alcohol or drugs or other discordant, disruptive ways in which they are trying to handle with the stress or the anxiety or the depression. So we turn to drugs, unfortunately, oftentimes, and why not? You watch TV, every single ad, it seems, during the nightly news is just another drug that's going to cure another thing. And it goes on and on and on. And we get hit with this idea that there's a drug that relieves every kind of pain that exists. Well, what I want to share with you over the next 5 slides are just some of the technical things that are going on if you're trying to understand what the mechanisms of action are, of how these addictions develop, what's occurring in the brain, what parts of the brain they're occurring. This one deals with, can we prevent opioid addiction? So it's looking at the dopamine reward system and the role that it plays, especially in removing the brakes that allow more dopamine to be released, and how drugs play a role in making that happen. In this slide, we see some of the physiological effects that are occurring related to the neurochemistry. In this slide, we're looking at how they can lead to addiction and the way in which these drugs like morphine, heroin, Oxycontin, and fentanyl work on the mu receptors in the brain. And then finally, we're looking at both, let me go back with this slide. We're looking at the prefrontal cortex and the relationship it has to substance abuse. And then finally, in the last slide, we're looking at how these yellow areas that you see here that were published back in 2007 have been affected by individuals who have experienced substance abuse for many, many years. So without going into too much of that, and just maybe one last slide here on empathy and pain. So if you're watching, that what this is trying to illustrate is that if you're watching people experiencing pain, in this case, electrical shocks, it's having a direct effect on some of the same regions of the brain that they're experiencing. So this is where this empathy comes from at a more neurochemical, physiological level. This is one of my friendly guinea pigs that we used in the heroin experiment at the university. And what we basically did, because many of you in the audience know that guinea pigs are one of the very few mammals, like humans, who do not produce vitamin C due to a mutation in the glucosinolactone oxidase gene, which results in their inability to synthesize this protein. And what happens is this enzyme catalyzes the reaction with oxygen and produces L-oxalo-hex-3 glucosinolactone, and this spontaneously forms what we know as ascorbic acid or vitamin C. And under conditions of stress, our demand for vitamin C increases. The difficulty we have as humans is when we're under stress, we have no way of increasing that vitamin C. So we're very dependent on the diet as a source to provide us vitamin C. And this is where that orthomolecular concept comes in, of providing a higher amount of vitamin C than you normally might get in the diet as a way of coping with the stress. And that could be stress that's psychological or physiological in nature. And so the guinea pigs were injected daily with 5% pure pharmaceutical heroin in sterile water until dependency was established. My colleagues did not like the idea of me going down into the barrios to buy street heroin. But so let's just say we had a renegade pharmacologist at the school who said, I can help you with that. And we were able to use pharmaceutical grade to keep it at a nice 5%. But what's important here is that was pretty much the 5% heroin level that was also being used in the streets of New York at the time when I was doing this study, because I would go back to New York each summer during the breaks. Thereafter, the solution was administered twice a day for 1 week. And when administration was withdrawn, we noticed significant behavior and locomotive changes, somewhat similar to the heroin withdrawal syndrome that was seen in humans. Now, there had been this study, which was published in 1992. This is the Johnson and Schauss study, where they point out vitamin C inhibits morphine withdrawal in guinea pigs. So although I was doing the study in 1969, I didn't publish those results because I could have probably gotten in a lot of trouble doing this type of study. But I just want you to know that there is a nice paper that shows this does actually work in guinea pigs, just the same thing that I had done experimentally many years earlier. This study shows that vitamin C decreases morphine. And this was a study that was done in rats. Now, rats can produce vitamin C, but they're giving super amounts of it intraperitoneal injections of vitamin C. They were doing 500 milligrams per kilogram IP. And again, the conclusion was that ascorbic acid does change the motivational processes underlying morphine self-administration. This study by Talhunche, and which, by the way, Libby and Stone were co-authors of this paper, were the effect of vitamin C on morphine self-administration in rats. And they're basically reporting the same thing. I'm just going through a little bit of literature here. So here we are, 1969. I'm taking the summer course at CCNY on the Harlem campus. This is between 135th and 141st Streets in Amsterdam Avenue. This is the campus of the university, and it's just a few blocks away from Columbia University and Rockefeller Hospital on 116th Street. So in early 1964, studies were beginning at Rockefeller Hospital with heroin addicts to establish the mode of action and potential effectiveness of a new drug that was synthetic in nature called methadone. Now, I wasn't aware of this in 1969, that these studies had begun. The researchers were contrasting methadone's effects to the action of short-acting opioids such as heroin and morphine. And they noticed that it prevented the addicts from feeling any high once they got an injection of heroin, a phenomenon that they referred to as narcotic blockade. So the former heroin addicts needed to take one oral daily maintenance dose, which allowed them to function normally. And this started this concept of methadone maintenance. And that research was then moved from the Rockefeller Hospital to Manhattan General Hospital, where the studies continued. Well, by 1973, the FDA had approved methadone. I was a little suspicious as to why, when I spoke to the chief medical officer down at City Hall in Manhattan and talked to him about the results of my experiment, I got a really cold response from him. And he asked me, what type of vitamin C was I using, thinking that it wasn't just ascorbic acid. He thought I was using some kind of an analog of vitamin C, a drug. That seemed to interest him, but vitamin C did not. So let me just go into exactly what I had actually used. I used sodium ascorbate. I got it from a company in La Cañada, California. It cost me at that time $11 a kilo. We would administer this with this protocol, which, by the way, took a little bit of tweaking to get it to the point where we were increasingly more confident we were getting rid of the withdrawals symptoms that individuals were experiencing. So on day one, we would drink the addict would drink 6 ounces of diluted fruit juice, and we would put about 500 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium ascorbate. If you're not familiar with it, it's 88% ascorbic acid, 12% sodium. And so it gives us kind of a little salty taste to the diluted fruit juice. And I diluted the fruit juice simply to ensure that we didn't give them an overload of too much fructose. We were more interested in diluting it just so that we could overcome the saltiness of the sodium ascorbate. By day 2, they would drink usually about 1,000 to 2,500 milligrams of the sodium ascorbate every 2 hours until bedtime. And the real key was that whenever they were experiencing withdrawal symptoms, it was time for them to drink some more. And we would raise the dose at that time. And we would keep raising the dose over the next 1 to 3 days, every single time that they experienced withdrawal syndrome, until they reached a certain point. And that is when the body had too much vitamin C. And when it reached that bowel tolerance where the stool started getting very thin, that we would begin to tape it down to the previous dosage, and then we would titrate it down to a maintenance dosage that they could leave with a nice bag of vitamin C that they could use for the next several days in case they experienced any other symptoms. So that was basically as simple as it was. On day 4, again, you're seeing that as soon as they wake up, we're administering some more vitamin C. By day 5, we've got the dosage going down now. And by the 6th day, we pretty well, in most cases, were able to release them, and they had gone through virtual no withdrawal syndromes. Now, as the word spread in the community around Upper West Side, Morningside Heights, and Harlem, we started getting more and more addicts coming in. And I want to tell you one quick story of what happened one day when I arrived. I just finished class, went over there, and I had this really angry addict, like sticking his fingers in my chest and saying, hey, Alex, I can't get high on vitamin C. What's the deal here? Well, what happened was he was released only a few days earlier, went down the corner, found somebody who could buy heroin, shot it up, and didn't get any euphoria out of it. So now he's mad. He got in a fight with the dealer, and he told the dealer that he was selling him, just sugar, and he wanted his money back. And anyway, they got in quite a fight. That's why his face was all bruised when I saw him. So that's why he was still angry, just waiting for me to show up. And that's when I realized that it had this incredible effect. It had occupied all the opioid receptors in the brain, and the amount of heroin that he was using wasn't giving him a high. So we had to now warn all the addicts that this was something they could expect was going to happen. So if you're going to go out in the street and get high as soon as you leave here, because now you've got your addiction under control, this is a problem you're going to have. So please understand, it's the vitamin C that's done this, and you can't change it. But if you'd like to stay off the heroin and you start experiencing any further withdrawals, here's the vitamin C in the bag, put one in each pocket, but don't go around selling it to people, okay? If they want to buy it, have them come over here and support this nonprofit organization, okay? So anyway, we tried to deal with it that way. One of the other things that was really a surprise was we did have a physician there at the facility. And one of the things he was monitoring was their blood work to see whether we would see any side effects. And that's why we started such low levels as we were titrating it higher and higher as we were working from one addict to another over the next month or two. One of the things he pointed out, he said, Alex, it seems to be treating their hepatitis A. And this is where I would later learn that, and I didn't understand how this could work, but I learned later on that vitamin C is a powerful antiviral. agent. And the mechanisms are well understood now, but that helped to explain how it was able to get rid of the hepatitis A in many of these addicts. So that was really, really interesting. So Dr. Pauling, we discussed my summer project in 1969, and he conversed with Vic Pollock and asked him, does it really work? And he told Dr. Pauling, absolutely, yes. So in 1975, Pollock wrote a paper, Megavitamin Therapy and the Drug Wipeout Syndrome, an introduction to the orthomolecular approach as a treatment for after effects of drug abuse and abuse. Bolerium books, a very hard book to find, by the way, but that's where sort of like his affirmation of the work that we had done in Harlem is described. Dr. Pauling also discussed the studies that Dr. Alfred Libby and Irwin Stone published, and those were published in 1977 in the journal Orthomolecular Medicine in volume 6, issue number 4. And they describe 100 cases using ascorbic acid and or sodium ascorbate in doses of 15 to 85 grams per day, gradually tapering down to 10 grams per day. And they reported that patients uniformly reported loss for craving for these drugs while on vitamin C. And this was the book that I wrote in 1978. Pauling asked me, please, Alex, write something down. I kept telling him that because I'm not a doctor, that I can't get these things published. Well, he said, then write a book. And I sat down one night, and 4 days later, this book was written. And I didn't know that when I sent it off to the publisher in Berkeley, that they would send it to Linus Pauling. Pauling didn't know who the author was, but he said, wow, I gotta say something good about this book. And he told the publisher and insisted on it, please put this quote and my signature on the cover of the author's book. And that's how Linus Pauling's signature appeared on my first book. I've now published 23 books in the field of nutrition and botanical medicine, working on my 24th book right now. But I can't thank Linus Pauling enough, because what happened as a result of his signature and name, notice my name is in the middle. I got so many people calling me, say, did you see this book that Dr. Pauling wrote? And so the book went out of print like in 2 weeks, and it went through a succession of additional printings. And one day, Michael Lesser called me up, who's a noted orthomolecular psychiatrist, and he said, Alex, I'd like you to write, can we publish a revision on this? I said, no, let me start on another book. And this time, rather than 4 days, it took me 4 months, because I wanted to write a lot more. I'd learned a lot more, and I'd also done a lot more studies now, including more controlled trials. And so I wrote Diet, Crime, and Delinquency. And the book on the left is the one that's extremely hard to find. And it happens to be, the last time I looked on eBay, it was like $135 a copy. And then the book on the right is far more nominal in cost. But it has something to do with the person who took the photograph that was done in Martha's Vineyard, where he's stabbing the donut. And somehow I hated that cover, because I didn't want to imply that everybody who's angry and has got a knife in their hand and stabs a donut, is a criminal or a delinquent. So I didn't like that. And so they came out with the other cover. So that's the story behind that. In 1978, Libby, Stone, Freeman, and Sanders reported on a 227 subject study published in 1978 that was performed at the San Francisco Drug Treatment Program. In that work, what they did, they used 186 addicts that were placed on medications for symptom relief, and 30 were then placed on vitamin C. 11 were placed on medication for 3 days, then followed with vitamin C alone. And their results were that vitamin C offers distinct advantages over medications. It's cost effective, it's not toxic, and leads to a willingness to receive more nutritional counseling. I mean, a lot of these addicts go, really? Vitamin C could do this? What else could other nutrients do? And that's when you get into talking about subclinical nutrient deficiencies and how those could help them with some of the other issues that are going on, both physiologically and psychological. And as word spread, as we experienced in Harlem, the effectiveness of vitamin C reached a lot of addicts in the Bay Area, and it was very easy from that point on to get volunteers to participate in additional studies. Dr. Janice Keller-Phelps, who's an allopathic physician and MD, is an addiction specialist, and she had worked with the National Institute that deals with addictions at NIH, the National Institute for Drug Abuse. And she had also worked with the Maryland prison system. And she came to King County, Seattle, Washington, as head of addiction and alcohol services. What brought her to Seattle was that her husband became president of the community college there in Seattle, Seattle Community College. And so she came to a lecture that I gave at a hotel near the SeaTac airport, Seattle-Tacoma Airport. And at the end of my presentation on the use of vitamin C, she just jumped out of her chair, went to the speaker's mic, said, "This is absolute nonsense. There's no way that vitamin C could help a single addict." And she was really angry. And so I simply said to her, "Janet, you have absolutely no evidence it doesn't work. And until you do, I suggest you just sit down and remain quiet." Well, she didn't like that. She came up even later on, just scolding me. "How dare, where'd you get your medical degree? Where's your credentials?" That was all that she cared about. I said, "Janet, here's what I'll do. I will introduce you to doctors from one end of the coast to the other, the West Coast, where I was living at the time. And you just talk to them, okay? Don't take my word for it. Talk to them, other allopathic physicians that you might trust." And she did that. And in fact, she flew to San Francisco. She flew to Los Angeles. She met with them. She watched how they did it. She brought it back to Seattle. And she decided she would work with 33 hardcore veteran street addicts using heroin and try exactly that protocol that I had started in 1969. It was so effective that she calls me up. She has the audacity to call me up and says, "Alex, this is the equivalent of a cure to cancer. How come everybody doesn't know about it?" And I said, "Janice, that's your job now, not mine. I've got other things that I'm busy doing right now." And she called up the National Institute at NIH. She told them what she had observed, what she'd been doing with addicts. And a group of NIDA officials came to Seattle. They spent 5 days observing the procedure. They met with me at City University. I was the research director there at the time, and agreed with Phelps' assessment. I will never forget the meeting we had with the president, vice president, Janice, myself, and the dean, who was my boss, who, by the way, was a well-known criminologist in the United States, and who had, I think, 6 textbooks being used by over 600 universities in the country at the time. And everybody agreed that this needed to be known nationwide. And I left that meeting with tremendous optimism that finally we'll be using vitamin C to treat opioid addiction. 8 months passed, and we didn't get any further communications from NIDA. And so the university called. They asked myself, the dean, the vice president, come to the office. And on a speakerphone, they declined to recommend it. They said it would reduce employment of staff at addiction services facilities in the United States by 80%. That was the reason they gave us for why they could not recommend that NIDA would support its use. I got to tell you, I was so angry when I walked out of there. That was one of those worst days of my life, because That was the day on which I began to realize there's other forces at play here that keep the orthomolecular movement from being all that it can. So nevertheless, of course, the truth never goes away. In 2000, the year 2000, in Vangello, they did a study of vitamin C effects on heroin withdrawal syndrome. And this was done in 30 patients, all hardcore addicts, 10 outpatient addicts, and they were administered 300 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. Roughly about 45 grams would be used a day for a 150-pound person. 30 patients were treated by conventional medicine that compared the results. And they pointed out that in just day 2, 90% of outpatients manifested mild to moderate withdrawal syndrome. 95% of inpatients manifested mild to moderate, but yet only 42% receiving conventional treatment had mild to moderate symptoms. So even at these doses, so they're not using the protocol, they're just sort of saturating these addicts. And I don't think this is the best approach. I highly recommend it be done on a titration basis. Start with a low dose and slowly work your way up. And remember, the key is when they experience symptoms, up the dose again, and it should have a attenuating effect on the dose. And then if an hour or two goes by and the pain in the stomach or the back or whatever is occurring, do it again, but go higher. Keep doing that until you reach bowel tolerance. And it's very rare that we ever had to go to bowel tolerance. But yes, you could go up to 45, 50, 60, 70, 80 grams in a day, depending on how addicted they were and how severe those withdrawals would be without the vitamin C. So in their study, they point out that by day 4, 0% of patients in the vitamin C group manifested withdrawal symptoms. 0% by day 4. None of the major symptoms and signs of withdrawal were reported compared to the control group. And it results in a 4-week follow-up that the patients who received the vitamin C, quote, expressed a vivid feeling of well-being with a strong improvement in appetite, psychokinetic behavior without any signs of depression or insomnia, in contrast to the control group. No blood, urine, or biochemical disturbance were recorded in any vitamin C patient, which reaffirms how safe it is. The author's conclusion was, our results strongly indicate that oral administration of high doses of vitamin C may be effective in ameliorating the withdrawal syndrome in opioid abuse, inpatient and outpatients, but further and intensive investigations is needed in order to clarify its mechanisms of action, the minimum dosage regimen, and the duration of administration. Is there hope for vitamin C usage for opioid addictions? Well, in 2018, a group of researchers published an update on the analgesic properties of vitamin C. They concluded that pain is an unpleasant subjective feeling, having implications on both physical and mental realm. They show that vitamin C has promising analgesic properties. With minimal adverse effects, vitamin C has performed well in treating different pain disorders, thus providing the way for this alternative interventional agent for pain management. Now, I want to point out that people do ask me sometimes when they, for example, have had surgery and they're experiencing pain, and the doctors have told them to take their Oxycontin or their opioid prescription. Maybe I just tell them, take 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C with medication. And they all report that what happens is they now could wait a much longer time than before they felt the urge to take medication. And I say, okay, the next time you do that, up your dose a little bit more when you take the medication, or reduce the pain relieving medication by half, but keep that vitamin C level at 1,000 or 2,000 milligrams. And almost every person over many, many years has reported this to be a very effective way of avoiding developing an addiction to the prescription drugs that you receive when you leave the hospital or the clinic or the doctor's office. So I hope this is going to be some help to those individuals who have become addicted. Well, Cameron and Pauling treated opioid addictions in the 1970s, and I just wanted to mention this because Drs. Cameron and Dr. Linus Pauling described dramatic decreases in opioid dependence in 5 patients with advanced cancer following high-dose vitamin C administration. This is the reason why in 1969, Dr. Pauling had to call me at 10 o'clock at night. He wanted to find out, was I aware of his cancer research? He wanted to know, how did I come up with this? And that, of course, I explained the guinea pig experiment that I did and the paper on vitamin C or ascorbic acids saturating opioid receptor sites. They pointed out that patients were in considerable pain due to skeletal metastases and given large doses of opioid analgesics, usually morphine or dimorphine. And within 5 to 7 days of commencing vitamin C, 4 out of 5 patients were completely free from pain. The 5th only required mild analgesics. This pretty much confirmed what I just told you earlier, but remember, this was reported by these 2 brilliant doctors in 1974. And here we are, and every single doctor in the country and the world is not using vitamin C to reduce dependency on these opioids that are being administered by the millions and addicting thousands of people unnecessarily. So in summary, opioid abuse is a significant global public health problem. Vitamin C modulates the dopaminergic, glutaminergic reward system. That's if you go back to those slides I showed you earlier, that trigger and maintain opioid dependency. All in vivo studies to date have shown that vitamin C at appropriate dose regimes can reduce the symptoms associated with heroin withdrawal syndrome. 5 decades of animal and human studies have shown the ability of vitamin C at appropriate dose regimes to reduce opioid dependency with minimal, virtual no risk of harm. Pain is usually a danger signal, unresolved, that can lead to opioid addiction if exposed to opioid medication or illicit sources. It is time for global public health agencies to promote the use of vitamin C to treat opioid dependency. And finally, here's Dr. Linus Pauling's advice to all of us. Orthomolecular treatment is the achievement and preservation of good mental health by provision of the optimum molecular environment for the mind, especially the optimum concentration of substances normally present in the human body, such as the vitamins. Let's listen to him every day that we practice, every day that we help people, every day that we provide guidance. Remind them of the power of these nutrients. Thank you.